A heart for the Dragon Lord. The winds howled across the jagged cliffs of Dravenmoor, carrying the scent of storm and fire. Below, waves crashed against the jagged rocks, their relentless rhythm a stark contrast to the eerie silence that clung to the obsidian fortress. Atop the obsidian throne, the dark dragon lord, Valerian, brooded in silence, his golden eyes flickering like molten ember in the dim torchlight. His reputation painted him as a monster, a cruel and unyielding warlord who ruled through fear and power. It was a reputation he had neither encouraged nor denied, for the world had little use for men who walked the gray line between justice and destruction. Valerian was no tyrant, but he was no savior either. He had razed cities in retaliation, crushed rebellions that sought to undermine his rule, and wielded the might of dragons to establish dominion over the treacherous lands of Dravenmoor. Yet, beneath the hardened exterior, he was a man who believed in balance, in retribution for those who deserved it, and mercy for those who had suffered enough. He abided by a strict moral code, one that prevented him from ignoring the fragile figure that had stumbled into his realm only nights before. She had been found near the southern borders shivering barefoot, and cloaked in nothing but tattered silks. Her skin, pale as moonlight, was marred with bruises, some old and faded, others fresh and raw. The moment Valerian's eyes had met hers, deep pools of violet, wide with fear, something within him stirred. He recognized the raw horror in her expression, the way her frame trembled like a caged bird finally tasting the idea of freedom. He had seen suffering before, had witnessed the broken remnants of war-torn souls, but something about her struck deeper. She carried not just the wounds of the flesh, but those of the spirit, a battle fought in silence, behind the cold walls of a palace that should have been her sanctuary. The fire of resilience flickered beneath the fear, a desperate desire to survive, to escape. And Valerian knew then, she was not just a lost girl. She was someone who had clawed her way through shadows to stand before him now. A princess. Though she had not spoken her title, Valerian knew. The insignia sewn into the ruined silk of her gown was unmistakable. The crest of Arundel, the neighboring kingdom that had long loathed his existence. And yet, this was no pampered royal accustomed to luxury. The bruises that marred her delicate skin, the scars barely concealed beneath her garments, told him all he needed to know. He stepped toward her cautiously, the heavy armor adorning his frame making his movements deliberate rather than slow. The girl flinched, pressing herself against the cold stone wall as if it might swallow her whole. Valerian raised a hand, palm open in a gesture of peace. "You have nothing to fear here," he said, his voice steady, yet softened. "No harm will come to you." Her violet eyes darted between his face and the guard standing behind him. Her breath was unsteady, shallow. He could almost see the war waging inside her, whether to believe him or brace for more cruelty. "You are Valerian," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if unused for some time. "I am." He studied her for a moment before adding, "And you are a long way from where you belong." Her lips parted, but no words followed. Instead, she swayed slightly, exhaustion overcoming her, and Valerian instinctively reached out. She did not recoil this time, too weak to resist. As his hand steadied her, he felt the thinness of her frame, the bones far too prominent beneath the silk. "She needs food, warmth, and rest," he ordered, turning to his steward. "See that she has all three." The girl's gaze flickered back to him, unreadable. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Because no one deserves to suffer as you have. Not even the daughter of my enemy." She had fled. She had sought sanctuary, but she had nowhere else to go. The horrors she had endured under her father's rule still clung to her like shadows, and the bruises on her skin were only a fraction of the torment she had barely escaped. She had seen his wraiths, the merciless executioners who carried out his will, and she had known she would not survive another day in Arendelle. Valerian was nothing like she had expected. The stories painted him as ruthless, but there was no cruelty in his gaze, only a quiet intensity that unnerved her. He had offered his help without demand, his presence as steady and warm as a shield against the cold. She welcomed it like a blanket draped over her weary soul, unsure whether it was safety or deception, but too exhausted to care. As days passed, Seraphina found herself healing, not just from the wounds on her body, but from the scars within her heart. Valerian ensured she had proper food, warm baths, and a place to rest where no one could harm her. He never forced her to speak, but when she did, he listened. She had been silenced for so long that the act of talking, of sharing fragments of her pain, felt foreign. But with him, it felt natural. Slowly, her strength returned. She spent afternoons in the castle gardens, breathing in air untainted by fear, and evenings in the vast library where Valerian would sometimes join her, a quiet presence beside her as she traced her fingers over the faded words of forgotten tales. One evening he found her staring at a book rather than reading it, lost in thought. When he asked what troubled her, she hesitated, then admitted, "I do not know who I am beyond my father's daughter, beyond what he made me." The vulnerability in her voice struck something deep within him, and he simply said, "Then perhaps it is time you decide for yourself." And then there were the moments, subtle, fleeting, when her heart betrayed her. Valerian began to notice the subtle changes in Seraphina, the way her heartbeat quickened whenever he was near. His dragon senses were attuned to such things, able to hear the rhythmic acceleration even when she tried to appear composed. He sensed it when he stepped close to guide her through a sparring session, correcting the angle of her wrist as she held a training blade. Her breath hitched, her pulse stammered, and her fingers trembled slightly under his touch. "Relax," he murmured, his deep voice brushing against her ear. She nodded, but her racing heart betrayed her. He said nothing of it, yet hope stirred in his chest. He caught her gazing at him, her eyes lingering before darting away, as if she was struggling to understand what she was feeling. As he guided her up a flight of stairs, his hand brushed hers, the contact brief but charged. He withdrew slightly, but not before feeling the warmth of her skin and noticing the way her breath caught. The moment stretched between them, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. When he shielded her from a sudden gust of wind on a cold night, draping his cloak over her shoulders, she hesitated before clutching it tightly, inhaling the warmth it carried. And when, in a moment of quiet reflection by the fire, she reached out and placed a tentative hand over his, the small, yet deliberate touch sent a shiver through him. He dared not move, afraid to shatter whatever fragile trust had formed between them. Her pulse would stutter when their fingers brushed, and when he stepped too close, the rapid flutter of her heart betrayed her more than her guarded expression ever could. Valerian felt hope stir within him, something rare, something dangerous. He had felt this pull from the first moment she had collapsed upon his doorstep, a battered yet unbroken force of resilience. Now, as her walls slowly crumbled, he saw the truth reflected in her stolen glances and unsteady breaths. She had once feared him, but now something else stirred inside her. Uncertainty, curiosity, and something dangerously close to longing. When he spoke to her, she found herself listening not just to his words, but to the timbre of his voice, the quiet gentleness hidden beneath the steel. And when their eyes met, she swore there was something unspoken between them, something that made her pulse quicken against her will. She caught herself drawn to him in ways that unsettled her, lingering too long in his presence, watching the way the firelight caught in his golden eyes, how he moved, with quiet strength. And when he caught her staring, offering a small knowing smirk, warmth spread through her chest, leaving her more breathless than she cared to admit. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to feel the same. Valerian had never been a man to fear conflict, but the accusations from Arundel were grave. They claimed he had stolen their princess, kidnapped her in an attempt to weaken their kingdom. A demand for her immediate return had arrived on swift wings, carried by a knight who dared not look Valerian in the eyes. The accusations were expected, but Valerian could not suppress the frustration tightening in his chest. He had fought many battles, endured betrayals and bloodshed, but this was different. It was not merely an accusation of war or conquest. It was a demand to erase the fragile trust he had built with Seraphina. The idea of sending her back into the hands of those who had broken her was unthinkable. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed, but the fire of his dragon blood burned hotter with each passing moment. He had not stolen Seraphina. She had come to him broken and desperate for refuge. And now, as the kingdom demanded her return, he knew the decision before him was more than just war or peace. It was about her, about what she truly wanted. He glanced at her from across the great hall, observing how she stood quietly by the fire, her fingers curled into the fabric of her gown. She did not speak, but he could feel her fear, her uncertainty. Yet beneath it something new stirred, something unspoken between them. He'd begun to notice the way her heartbeat quickened when he was near, a sound imperceptible to most, but as clear as thunder to him. He had caught her gaze lingering more frequently, her eyes tracing the contours of his face before she quickly looked away. He felt the air shift with her nearness, sensed the way her presence became more attuned to his, her breath subtly hitching when their paths crossed. It was a silent confession, one that stirred something deep within him. She was afraid of what would happen, yes, but she was no longer afraid of him. And that knowledge filled him with something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. They will not ask twice, his most trusted general Gavriel warned. If you refuse, they will march. Valerian's golden eyes flickered toward the princess, Seraphina. She had been listening, though she had not spoken much since her arrival. He had given her space, yet he could sense the war within her. She was terrified. Of them. Of him. Of returning to the place she had barely escaped. Seraphina. His voice was deep, reverberating through the stone walls of the keep. Tell me the truth. If I return you to them, what fate awaits you? A shudder ran through her, so violent that she clenched her hands into fists to still them. Her lips parted, but no words came at first, and then finally a whisper, so soft he had to strain to hear it. Death would be kinder. Something cold settled in his chest. Rage, unfamiliar and consuming, burned beneath his ribs. Gavriel exhaled sharply. Then we prepare for war. Seraphina flinched. Valerian caught the movement instantly. She was afraid, not of the battle, but of what it meant. She had known suffering, but she did not wish to be the cause of more bloodshed. I do not want to be a reason for destruction, she murmured, voice stronger now. But I also cannot go back. Please, do not send me back. It was the closest she had come to pleading, and Valerian knew he had already made his decision the moment she arrived in his realm. The days passed in tense anticipation. Valerian's forces stood ready, but Seraphina had remained withdrawn. He would catch her staring at him from across the hall, her gaze wary, yet searching. He could sense the turmoil within her. And worse, he could feel something more dangerous brewing between them. The pull. She was hesitant, but she did not push him away, not when he offered his cloak to shield her from the cold, not when his fingers brushed hers as he handed her a goblet of wine, not when his gaze lingered on her lips longer than it should. She wanted him, even if she was afraid of it. And he would not take what was not freely given. One evening, as the torches flickered with golden fire, she approached him in his chamber. Her heart pounded, but she could no longer deny what she felt. Every time I look at you, I see something I do not understand, she admitted. I was told you were a monster, but when I am near you, I feel safe, and I do not know if I should run from that or embrace it. Clad in a simple gown, she looked softer than she had in days, but her hands trembled at her sides. "Why are you different?" she asked. "Everyone told me you were a monster, a beast who burned cities and feasted on destruction. But you are nothing like that." Valerian exhaled slowly. "Because monsters do not follow codes, Princess. I have rules, and one of them is that I do not harm those who do not deserve it." Her throat bobbed. "And what do I deserve?" He stepped closer slowly, giving her space to flee if she chose. "You deserve to be free." A tear slipped down her cheek, and then, without warning, she closed the distance between them. A hesitant hand pressed against his chest, over his heart. Her warmth seeped through his tunic, igniting something primal within him, but he held still. He would not rush this. "And what do you want?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "More than I should." She didn't retreat. Instead, she tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze, and this time there was no fear, only fragile trust. "Then take what is yours." Valerian did not claim her lips in a searing kiss. Not yet. Instead, he lifted a hand, brushing his fingers along her cheek, feeling the way her breath hitched. He would wait. Until she was truly ready, he would wait. But war was coming, and waiting was a luxury they might not have for much longer. As dawn approached, the air grew thick with anticipation. Valerian stood atop the castle ramparts, watching the horizon darken with the approach of Arendel's forces. His generals whispered among themselves, some advocating for an immediate strike, others urging caution. Gavriel stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "They have siege weapons. If we let them come too close, our defenses will be tested beyond their limits." Valerian remained silent for a moment, weighing the options. He turned to Seraphina, who stood at his side, her fingers gripping the hilt of a blade she had yet to wield in battle. "This is your fight as much as mine," he said quietly. "You do not have to face it, but if you choose to stand with us, you must be ready." She met his gaze, something resolute settling in her expression. "I will not run again." Only then did Valerian nod, stepping forward as the first war horns blared across the battlefield. At dawn, the armies of Arendelle arrived at his gates. "Dark Dragon Lord," a voice bellowed. "Return the princess, or face annihilation." Valerian stepped onto the balcony, his gaze sweeping over the battlefield. He could see their king, a cruel man with cold, dead eyes, the same eyes Seraphina had once feared. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. "You will not have her." A scoff. "She belongs to us." A moment later, Seraphina herself stepped beside Valerian. Her voice, though softer than his, carried across the battlefield with surprising strength. "I do not belong to you, and I will never return." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the first arrow flew. The battle began. Valerian fought with the fury of a dragon, his sword cutting through enemy ranks with precision. Yet, even as he struck down his foes, the battle was not without struggle. A well-placed spear grazed his arm, sending a sharp sting of pain through him. He gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on his weapon as he pushed forward. The weight of battle pressed against him, but his focus never wavered. He was fighting for something greater than victory. He was fighting for her. His army, loyal and fierce, held the line, but it was Seraphina who turned the tide. With her own blade, she struck down the man who had once held her captive. And as the sun rose, the banners of Arendelle fell, tattered and broken. Victory was theirs. As the battlefield quieted, Seraphina turned to him, breathless and stained with war. "What now?" Valerian stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "You are my strength as much as I am yours, Seraphina. I have fought wars, conquered lands, but nothing has ever mattered as much as the way you look at me now. Now, you are truly free, and if you choose to stay, you will stay not as my prisoner, but as my queen." Tears glistened in her eyes. But this time, they were not of sorrow. She did not hesitate as she reached for him, pressing her lips to his. The Dark Dragon Lord had chosen love over war, defying the expectations of the world that had only ever seen him as a conqueror. In protecting Seraphina, he had found something he had long believed unattainable: redemption, purpose, beyond battle, and a love fierce enough to rival the fire within his soul. And in doing so, he had won more than just a kingdom. He had won her heart.